This video is going to go over how to effectively train to touch your toes and the biomechanics behind what needs to happen at the hip, pelvis, and lumbar spine to allow for forward folding to occur unrestricted. And we're going to go over some of my favorite exercises I've found to be most effective in getting people to not only touch their toes, but eventually palm the floor with ease if you're interested in more advanced ranges of motion for activities like gymnastic strength. Now, the ability to fold forward requires a proper understanding of how to actually hinge at the hip. Now, in order to access a proper hip hinge, the pelvis needs to be able to tilt forward over the femur, and this is known as an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, I find it helpful to understand the relationship between the pelvis and femur and what an anterior pelvic tilt actually does down the chain. So when the pelvis tips forward over the femur, this will draw the femurs into internal rotation. So if we can't access hip internal rotation, then we're not going to have a very effective hip hinge. So therefore, the ability for someone to fold forward is actually a good measure of hip internal rotation. So here are some tests to show if we're limited in hip internal rotation. First test is an active supine straight leg raise test. So we're gonna lie on our back with both legs completely straight. Now I'm going to be testing my left leg here, and I'm going to point my toe toward the nose, lock out the knee, and I'm going to raise my leg up straight, and I want to see where the first barrier of resistance is. Now this test is over if I see any knee bend whatsoever, or if I see this trail leg start to bend excessively. So after about 45 degrees of this straight leg raise, the femur needs to be able to internally rotate in the socket to achieve greater range of motion. So therefore, if we can't access a clean 70 to 90 degrees of straight leg raise, then that's a good indication that we're limited in hip internal rotation. We can also look at hip internal rotation directly, and I like to do this supine as well. So we'll lay on the back, flex the hip to around 90 degrees. We're going to place a hand on the inside of the knee, and we're going to rotate the foot outside of the knee. A couple compensations we want to look out for is this pelvis will hike. If we're missing some internal rotation, we're trying to steal more room at the low back and pelvis. And we'll also see this knee dive in excessively. And that's why we like to keep a hand support on the inside of the knee to prevent that. And we'll also see the torso kind of turn away. So we want to look out for all these compensations if you're testing your clients or if you're doing this yourself. Now, if we see a big discrepancy between the two, say we have a lot of femoral internal rotation, but we can't effectively achieve a straight leg raise past 45 degrees, then something's missing there, and we're probably cheating our range of motion somewhere, most likely at the low back. So if we have a good straight leg raise, we should see good internal rotation isolated with this test. And if we have good internal rotation, we should be able to see a good straight leg raise as well. So we want to be able to compare these tests and see where some of these compensations are happening. With internal rotation, we want to see somewhere between 30 to 45 degrees of internal rotation here. I'm at about maybe 25 to 30. Could probably get there with a little bit more passive overpressure, but I am a little bit limited. Okay, now the juicy stuff, the exercises. This first exercise is actually quite simple, but feels really good. And this is a stretch for the obliques, specifically the external oblique. Now the obliques, when they get stiff, they can prevent that anterior pelvic tilt from occurring because the obliques, they not only hike the pelvis and side bend you ipsilaterally, but they also will pull the pelvis into a posterior pelvic tilt. So to stretch that, we'll need to go the opposite way. So a good way I like to stretch them, I like to bend my knees and hips to about 90 degrees. And now in this position, I'm now side bent toward the left side. Therefore, I'm stretching the right obliques. Now to really get into the stretch, I'm going to rotate my torso toward the ground and try to anteriorly tilt my pelvis as much as I can. And from here, I should feel a nice stretch and good lengthening on this bottom side oblique, and I could just breathe into it. So from this angle, you can see I'm nice and anteriorly tilted. I'm not tucked under. You might feel a stretch here, but that would most likely be in the QLs back here. So we really want to stay anteriorly tilted, pelvis rotated forward, and side bend away and rotate toward the ground. I like to take some nice deep breaths in here, in through the nose, out through the mouth, 5 to 10 breaths each side. So now we're going to work on hinge specific mobility for the hips. Now, I like to use this wall reference single leg deadlift to work on improving hip internal rotation while we're hinging. And this is going to serve as a really good loaded stretch for the glutes as well as the posterior hip capsule. So we should not only feel the glutes stretching, but we should feel them really burning and shaking during this drill. So let's go over it. So if I'm working my left leg, I'm going to place my right leg on the wall for support. And this is going to give us reference to push into. Now we want to be about a foot away from the wall. If we're too close, then this leg's going to be too bent. But to start, we want the two kneecaps to be directly across from each other. So I'm going to keep a slight knee bend on the working side leg. And from here, I'm going to shift my hip back and up. Okay? If we just focus on shifting the hip back, then we are going to lose tension in the glute. So we want to think about pulling the hip up as well. And now we're pulling the hip up, we want to think of bringing this non-working knee down. So this motion, this scissoring motion, is getting us to sink into that posterior hip capsule, and we should automatically feel a lot of lengthening in that lateral posterior hip. Okay, so we want to think about pushing our foot into this wall to drive this knee down. And we're getting this side of the pelvis to hike in relation to the opposite side. So this side of the pelvis is now dropping lower. And this is turning our belly button toward this working side knee, getting that relative hip internal rotation occurring. So we can do this all in one smooth motion. Keep that slight knee bend, pull this knee down, and move into a hinge. Notice I don't need much weight. We could load this up, but we really can get a lot out of this with just our body weight. And I'm not hinging so far that my hands are touching the ground, okay? Because this is just moving through our low back and lumbar spine. When I do this, I'm basically only moving my hand toward the mid-shin. So from here, I can hold this isometrically, thinking about shifting my center of mass forward onto the balls of my toes. And if we want extra spice, hover the heel in this position. Now we're getting the calves more involved, but we're also lengthening that lever and really firing up the glutes even more. Okay, so I can hold this isometrically. I can even pulse in and out of end range, and then hold isometrically at the end, really fighting to pull this knee down toward the ground. So anywhere from 10 to 15 pulses with a 20 to 40 second isometric at the bottom is money. And we should be able to retest our forward fold after that. And my left side feels much lighter and much easier to sink into that hinge. Now, a couple things we want to look out for is we don't want to overly rotate as we're hinging down, because if we are really limited in hip internal rotation, what's going to happen is if we take up all the range of motion at the hip from the start, then we have no room to move into internal rotation as we hinge. So what we'll see happen is this leg will actually bow out into external rotation, and we will fall onto the lateral edge of our toes. We really want to make sure we're keeping the ball of the big toe in contact with the ground the entire time. Another thing we'll see happen is as we pull this knee down and we hinge, then it's just going to shove our hip out to the side, but our belly button is actually going to turn away. Okay, we don't want that. We want to keep the belly button forward, or if anything, slightly across, so it's hovering over the working side knee. So now that we've learned to properly shift into the hip during hip hinging exercises, we can now work on getting some effective length into the hamstring specifically. So my favorite drill for this is the stride stance hinge, or the stride stance good morning. Now the reason I like this drill is because it's extremely effective for people who have a difficult time achieving that anterior pelvic tilt in their hinge, because we will pre-position the back leg in extension. Now look what that does to the pelvis. As I pre-position this back leg in extension, it actually draws the pelvis into this forwardly tipped position and extends the spine. So now, as we hinge, we can't really cheat. We're already pre-positioned in this anterior pelvic tilt. And I really like a support under the front leg, because this stride stance position is a very unstable position. And we never want instability to be a limiting factor during our range of motion development exercises. We want to have all the intention placed on moving deeper into a range of motion each repetition. So don't skip this, use some support under the leg. So now, as we perform this exercise, we can start hand over the head to lengthen the lever, and we're gonna lead with the belly button and come back out of it. So as we're hinging, we wanna make sure the belly button isn't rotating away. We wanna keep that belly button tracking over the kneecap, and think about pulling that femur deeper into the socket each repetition. So I like performing this for more dynamic repetitions with a static hold on the last rep. Now, once something like hands overhead gets comfortable for you, we can actually load it up with a light weight. Again, leading with the belly button and coming out of it. We can even load heavier and hold in a suitcase grip with dumbbells directly by the side. So with the dynamic repetitions, we want to keep something in mind. I like to do about a 2 to 3 second hold at the bottom each repetition before coming out, but with the intention of pulling yourself deeper into that stretch position each rep. So that might look like this. Instead of just using the stretch reflex to bounce ourselves out of the range, we stay in it and pull deeper. So I'm going to hinge forward. I hit that first barrier of resistance, and now I'm going to pull with my hip flexors and quads, pull myself into a deeper position, then push through the heel to come out. So we're really trying to fire those hip flexors to anterior tilt the pelvis even more and keep that femur pushed back into the socket. So we'll perform maybe 8 to 12 repetitions with maybe a 10 to 15 second hold at the end. So give that a try, and of course, retest your forward fold. So now we can put the pieces together and load the global pattern of the forward fold using the Jefferson curl. So we can use a light weight to start, maybe a kettlebell or a dumbbell, and we can work ourselves up to using a barbell. Now with this exercise, we want to keep the feet relatively close together. We want to squeeze the quads to make sure the knees stay completely locked out. So the movement's going to start with segmentation of the spine, where we can use flexion of the entire spinal column to drag our pelvis into that anterior pelvic tilt so we can really lengthen the hamstrings. So I'm going to tuck the chin, protract my shoulders, round the upper back, and start to round forward. And now we're getting into the lumbar spine rounding. And once we start getting past the shins here, we can start to think about anteriorly pelvic tilting from this rounded space, and I'm sending my hips back a bit. So I'm going to hit this barrier of resistance here in my hamstrings, and I'm going to squeeze my quads as hard as possible. Think about pulling into more anterior pelvic tilt, even though I'm in a flexed spinal position. And then I can shift my center of mass forward to allow that weight to pull me deeper in the stretch. And from here, I can kind of segment my way back out of it. And we can perform this for reps. I like very low repetitions here and spending ample time here at the bottom, anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds, just breathing, contracting the hip flexors. So anywhere from about 3 to 5 repetitions with a 5 to 10 second hold each rep. Now, a way we can make this more effective is by elevating our toes. And no, we're not going to get more length in the hamstrings through elevating our toes. That's not what this is about. We will be tensioning the sciatic nerve a little bit more, which, if you're not used to that sensation, be very gentle with this to start, and maybe work with just your body weight or a very light weight to start with, so you don't irritate those nerves. But the benefit of using a wedge or elevating your toes on some plates is that it forces you to shift your weight back as you hinge, and this is going to help you effectively get into the hamstrings as you're folding forward into the Jefferson curl. So here's how this looks. See, I shift my hips back, and then once I get to the bottom, I can now pull myself forward, shift my center of mass forward. Yes, this is going to be tensioning that sciatic nerve, but that's also a good thing. We need the nerves to be able to run smoothly through their nerve sheaths in order for us to access our deepest forward fold position. So once again, I shift those hips back, pull with the hamstrings, then I can lean my body weight forward a bit, allow the weight to pull me deeper, and come out of it. And lastly, we want to make sure our hip flexors are strong enough to help overcome the stretch reflex when we're in these forward fold positions. Because if we can strengthen the hip flexors in their shortened range of motion, then we'll have better awareness on how to fire those muscles at the end range of motion of our hamstrings to assist us in pulling deeper into the stretch. So we could set up in our close to max range hip flexion with a straight leg. And what we could do is create this anterior pelvic tilt that we're after, and we can lift, hold, 1, 2, 3, back down. Tighten up at the torso, anterior pelvic tilt, and lift, 1, 2, 3, back down. We're searching for this crampy sensation in the hip flexors and quads. Now, if we're finding it really difficult to lift here, what we can do, a special trick here to add a little bit more oomph in our lifts, is we can place a heavy weight over the foot, something so heavy that we can't lift. We could drive into it isometrically, about 3 to 5 repetitions of 5 to 10 seconds, maximally pushing into the weight. This is called an overcoming isometric, and what it's doing is it's ramping up our nervous system. We're improving this motor unit recruitment to the hip flexors and quads, and then we can release the weight and then perform these lift-offs. And you'll notice you can lift much higher. So we could do these anywhere from 6 to 10 repetitions with a 3 to 5 second hold at the top each rep, or we could perform 3 to 5 repetitions of 5 to 10 second overcoming isometrics, followed by 5 to 10 lifts. There you have it, guys. Those are some of my favorite exercises I like to use to improve the ability to hinge and forward fold. Now, where do you start? So maybe your forward fold currently looks like this. And this is the inability for the pelvis to genuinely anterior tilt. So I would suggest you prioritize things like the oblique stretching and wall-referenced kickstand deadlifts to really improve that hip internal rotation and that genuine ability to anterior tilt and get some good lengthening through the glutes. And I also have other drills on my channel that accomplish the same thing. Now, if your forward fold is starting to look like this, maybe you're starting to be able to touch your toes, it's just not very comfortable. Now you're able to get the pelvis to tilt forward over the femur, and now it's just a matter of creating more length in the hamstrings and still some of the glutes. So now you can use methods such as the stride stance hinge or even the Jefferson curl to really load those hamstrings eccentrically and improve that full position of the forward fold. And also, no matter where you are in your journey, you can benefit from some hip flexor strengthening either through full range or directed at the shortened range. Now, I encourage you to take some of the assessments at the start and try some of these exercises out and see if it improves your forward fold. And if you still need some guidance on how to structure some of these exercises in a well-rounded flexibility plan, then I do offer one-on-one coaching for this. So please reach out or just ask any questions, and I'd be happy to answer any of them regarding some of these exercises. Now, I'm going to be honest. If you try some of these exercises, you'll most likely notice some immediate changes, but it's going to take months, maybe even years, for these changes to stick permanently. The ability to wake up in the morning cold, without a warm-up, and palm the floor takes a lot of convincing for the nervous system over time to show it that you've built strength through these ranges of motion and tolerance to handle these deep stretches. give this time, give this patience, accept that your range isn't going to always feel looser week to week or day to day. You may be sore. That's okay. That means you're training it effectively. And we want to make sure we are progressing in either range of motion or weight over the course of months and years. So make sure you're taking data and tracking appropriately, and take videos of yourself. That's the best way to know if you're making improvements, is if you can look back months, years down the line and see where your forward fold was at compared to now.